So once again, my name is Jay Martin. I'm the host of this conference for the next 2 days. I also host a podcast called The Jay Martin Show. And when I come up with the agenda, when we're trying to figure out which speakers we want to bring on stage and which conversations we want to host, there's a lot of content, about 67 different keynote speeches, panel discussions, and debates, fireside chats that are going to happen at this conference today and tomorrow. I think 140 different company talks. It's a whole lot of stuff, right? So it really helps if I have some kind of a central theme that I can use to guide my decision making, right? So I use this, I develop a central theme, what's most important in the world today when it comes to the commodity sector. And I use that as my North Star, and then we build all of the agenda content around that theme. Now, this year's theme is also the name of this morning's talk, The Changing World Order, and then obviously how to come out on top. Now, truthfully, I should have put a question mark after the changing world order, because far more than I want to inform you about the changing world order, I want to ask the question, are we moving through some kind of a changing world order? And if we are, what does that look like? What stage are we at? And what can we do about it? Now, the reason I chose this theme this year is because it was, without question, the most common conversation that I had on my podcast this year. We have 2 conversations every single week, and with crazy frequency, everybody wanted to talk about the potential of us departing the existing world order and moving towards whatever's next. I was also a guest on probably 20 other podcasts, and every single time this question came up in different ways, right? Some people want to ask, are we entering the sunset years of the American empire? Maybe I should define this. What is the world order that I'm referring to? We live in the American world order, right? And prior to this was the British world order. Prior to that, the Dutch world order. Prior to that, the Spanish. Prior to that, the Portuguese. There's actually been 5 global empires inside of just the last 600 years, which gives us a bit of a hint, right, at the expeditious nature with which power does rotate around the world. So that's how we got to our North Star this year. It came up in conversation far too frequently to be ignored, and the implications of this could be really, really significant, right, to the pros and the cons if you're paying attention. Now, topics like this, the changing world order, the American empire entering its sunset years, can be subject to a bit of doom and gloom narrative, right? You can imagine like, oh, we're heading towards the end of the American empire, and you see imagery of, Rome and crumbling colosseums and fire and crisis and crash and all this stuff. And that's not my take on this, by the way, right? When I talk about the changing world order and the potential that we're departing one and heading towards the next, I don't come at it from a doom and gloom perspective. I understand why people do, and I want to caution you about that, right? Because the doom and gloom business is a fantastic business if you're in it, because people are always buying what you're selling, but it doesn't make them right? And we know why this is the case, right? If it bleeds, it leads, like media knows this. I can sell you a scary story far easier than I can sell you a positive one. And we're not just attracted to the car crash because we're biologically engineered to be scared of things. It's also just logical, if I'm being honest, because pessimism sounds like someone's trying to help you, right? Things are going to get really bad, but here's what you can do about it. That sounds helpful. Whereas optimism sounds like someone's trying to sell you something. The value of this is going to go up, and you should buy today. Nobody wants to be sold, but everybody wants to be helped. And so we gravitate towards the pessimistic headlines. Not always in our best interest. It doesn't make them right, all right? But business understands this, so we get sold a lot of pessimistic headlines. So to depart from that, right, because I want to understand really what's happening so I can position myself accordingly and not get sucked into hyperbole and sensational headlines. I want to depart from the noise and get to the signal. And the only way I can determine to do that is to step back from the daily headlines and look at the past, right? And if we study history, it helps us understand the present. And that's how I approach this, and that's how I'm going to approach this morning in this morning's talk. So, real quick, in the last 600 years, we've seen the rise of 5 empires. We had the Portuguese Empire about 600 years ago. They ruled the world with their maritime currency until the Spanish took over about 500 years ago. And the Spanish ruled the world until about 400 years ago. At the end of the 30 Years' War, when they fell, they went essentially bankrupt, fighting wars all over the world, which typically happens at the end of an empire. And the Dutch took over. And the Dutch guilder became the world reserve currency until 200 years ago, at the end of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, again, a multi-regional war, bankrupted the Dutch Empire. And the British and the pound sterling took over. The sun would never set on the British Empire. And eventually, the sun set on the British Empire. And America really affirmed their power, of course, at the end of World War II. Again, huge war, empire collapses, new empire takes over. So what can we learn from this? Like, number one, power does rotate very expeditiously. Number two, often an empire comes to its end as a consequence of fighting too many wars in too many places. But if we go deeper into this, we'll find out that that's not conclusive evidence of where we might be in this cycle of power. And so here's a fun exercise. If we review in detail the previous 4 empires and ask the question, are there consistent markers every single time during the sunset years of these empires that tell us, right, we are now in decline? Is there a story that is repeated? And turns out there is. Diving into the key behaviors and activities inside of these empires is like watching the same movie on repeat again and again and again, which is super, super helpful because that allows us to look at these previous 4, find out what was going on during their declining years, and then ask ourselves the question, how much of that is present today in our world? And get a bit more clarity, right, on where we might be. At this moment, where are we, right, in history? So there's 3 main red flag activities that we see during the declining years of all the empires we discussed and many more before that. And the first is financial insolvency or financial instability, right? We have an empire who becomes overextended, essentially spending more than they're earning. They have military obligations all over the world. They have a wealthy population that demands a lot, so they're subsidizing living expenses. And they become less productive because that's what happens when you get wealthy, right? So they start spending more than they're earning, and they can continue this for a certain amount of time until eventually they have to start printing more money to cover their losses. So money expansion is the first big red flag that we see at the sunset, during the sunset years of every empire. Now, this won't be news to most of you in this room, but what happens when you expand the money supply? Right? You devalue the currency. If you print more currency, that currency is worth less. But as a consequence, the things that you can't print, like land, maybe precious metals, and businesses, those things go up in value. And so there's this disparity that exists. Now, typically, the people that own those things, the land, the precious metals, the businesses, is generally the more affluent end of the population. And so they get wealthier, right? But everybody else who's just earning and holding and spending in currency, they're getting poorer, right? Relative to those who own the stuff. And this is fundamentally how wealth disparity is created, because every year we go further down this path, we create more money, we devalue it further, the gap between the haves and the have-nots increases, and eventually people begin to despair because the house that they couldn't afford last year is now less affordable this year, as the currency they're holding is worth less. The asset's the same, it's the paper that's changed. And as a consequence of most people not really diving into monetary policy, I mean, it's designed to be complex, right? People don't understand why this is occurring, but they're angry because they're not living the life that they thought they would. They're not living the dream they heard about, right, a generation ago. They don't know why. And when you're upset and you don't know who you're upset at, you'll find an enemy every single time. And so this is when red flag activity number 1, being money expansion, leads to red flag activity number 2, which is internal conflict. People begin fighting and arguing over whose fault all of this is, that their life isn't materializing the way they thought it would. Civil unrest. People can't agree on anything anymore. Small issues become big issues. Everything becomes polarized. Now, a nation could function this way for a really long time, in this state of relative dysfunction, until the third red flag emerges. And that's an external competitor. You need somebody else who can stand up and challenge the dysfunctional empire and send a signal to the world that says, that's not going so well. I don't think we can trust them anymore. Come do business with us. We've got a better way. And until that external competitor arrives, you can maintain this disorder for a very, very long time. Now in history, it's rarely ever one country that rises up to challenge the existing empire. Almost every single time it's a collection, like a syndicate of smaller countries who are able to park their ideological differences aside in order to unite against the global superpower. So think about even World War II, right? Soviet and American soldiers fighting shoulder to shoulder, ideologically opposite, but united in their fight. And once that fight was over, those ideological differences boiled right to the surface right away, and we found ourselves in the Cold War. A lot of people would argue that today that's the BRICS, or the BRICS plus nations, right? Who are rising up, creating new trading blocks, and presenting this challenge to the American world order. I think you can make a pretty good case that all three of these red flags are kind of present in today's world. Some more than others, right? But you can make a case, couldn't you? So, what does that mean, right? First of all, I opened this talk by warning you not to take doom and gloom pundits seriously, and I just outlaid a case that's kind of doom and gloomy. So I want to say a few things. First of all, what have we learned? That 5 empires inside of 600 years have come and gone, or at least come, right? Yet, the quality of our life over that same time period, which direction has it gone? It's just gone up and to the right, right? The length of time we're living is up. Infant mortality is down. Access to clean water and medicine is up. Violent crime is down. Global poverty is down. I mean, generation over generation on a global scale, despite the heavy rotation of power, our lives keep getting better. So first of all, step back, it's okay. We're going to be just fine as we go through these cycles. But secondly, if we can look at the declining years of these empires and find those flags, those similar activities that are present every single time and give us some context on where we're at today, then maybe we can study the emergent years of those same empires and find similar behavior. Did they all do the same thing on the rise up? Because they all did the same thing on the way down. So maybe the movie plays on both sides, and yeah, it turns out it does. Watching the rise of an empire again and again and again is like watching the same movie on repeat again and again and again. Now, why this is important is because, personally, I want to emulate the behaviors of the empire on the way up, not the behaviors of the empire on the way down. And we can do this. So what do we see when we look at the emerging empire? How does a nation go from, poverty and obscurity to national superpower? I mean, it's crazy to think that only 250 years ago, the United States was more or less a third world country clinging to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, really, 250 years is not that long to have gained the global influence and domestic affluence that they have. So what happens, right? What are the initial seeds that we see every single time as a nation begins to emerge? And the first thing that we see every single time is alignment in values. The nation becomes aligned, and it doesn't matter so much what they're aligned on. It can be cultural, it can be political or religious. It matters less what they're aligned about. It just matters that they're aligned and they're agreeing, because if they are, it just means there's going to be less infighting, right? Less civil unrest that stalls the rise of so many emergent nations is the infighting and the inability to agree on which direction the nation should go. But this alignment has to go all the way to the top, right? Because you need governance that supports that. If you have a nation who's aligned in their values, they're more likely to cooperate and therefore be productive. But you need governance that incentivizes productivity. If you have a great population, but governance that's corrupt and oppressive, again, you're stalling out growth right away. So the alignment has to go from the bottom all the way to the top. And if it does, then the population gets productive. And productivity builds wealth. And that's how they get started. Now, the next thing that happens in every single one of these empires is that they take that wealth and they reinvest it in education. And education becomes the pillar that allows one generation to improve upon the one before it. Hypercritical. Build your competitive advantage by getting better, right? They invest in education, and the better educated public builds more innovation into their economy, and they start building better stuff, right? And they're building better stuff. They attract the attention of the global market, and they begin taking part in global trade and entering, right, the world trade system. Now, this is like It's like the funnest part of empires to study is the innovation years, because countries come up with the coolest stuff, and the Dutch are worth spending just a minute on. So the Dutch Empire, this is the golden age of conquest, right? And maritime trade. When countries would set out to sea, explore new lands, meet new people, take their stuff, and come home, right? Crude description, but not inaccurate. I might mention that maybe not much has changed on that front. But because of the industry at the time, the technology of note was, of course, ships, right? Whoever had the fastest, most capable ships could get overseas, do trade deals or conquest, bring stuff back fast, right? Bring goods back to the country. So whoever had the fastest, most capable ships won. And the Dutch had the best ships in the world. But it wasn't necessarily the ships themselves that's the interesting part. It's the way they had the ships built. So conquest is like horribly expensive, right? And super, super risky. You're sending these boats overseas for you don't know how long. Many won't come back because the seas are dangerous. There's pirates, there's disease, all kinds of reasons. That ship may never come home. And when they do come home, it's not a guarantee they'll have any goods on it, right? Trade deal could have gone south, could have found nothing. Who knows? And those that do come back may have been gone for years at a time. Lots of cash outlay here, right, to finance these expeditions. You got to buy or build a ship or a fleet of ships. You got to hire a crew. You got to stock the boat for you don't know how long with supplies. And there's no guarantee any of it's coming back. It's a hugely risky bet. And as a result, it's like a really small percentage of people that were willing to finance these explorations, right? A few select wealthy merchants and sometimes the government. And that was it. That was the access to capital that they had. And that limited the amount of world trade and conquest they could accomplish. Until the Dutch came up with the world's first ever publicly traded company. Of course, this is the Dutch East India Company, traded on the world's first stock exchange. And for the first time ever, what this allowed is that anybody could now participate in financing these expeditions. Now, a couple things happen here, right? The captains of these ships now have access to a massive pool of capital. It means they can build ships a lot faster, they can build more ships, they can depart more frequently, right? Cash does these things, and they had access to more cash than ever before. But in addition, it reduced the risk that any one investor had to bear, because it wasn't, 4 wealthy merchants financing this trip. It was 1,000 Dutch citizens spreading that risk out. And so if things went south, it was less likely that somebody got wiped out. Now, this worked so well that at the height of the Dutch Empire, the Dutch East India Company, one company, accounted for a full third of the entire world's global trade. It's crazy when you look at Holland on a map. And you're like, how on earth did this little country and one company inside of that little country account for a full third of the world's global trade? And then when I talk about reinvesting the new wealth into education, the Dutch crushed that. And at their peak, 8% of the world's universities were based in the Netherlands. 12% of books published globally were published in the Netherlands. Again, tiny little country. You'd never suspect. I would have never suspected. Now, another innovation that really boosted the success of the Dutch East India Company was a special deal that they struck with the Dutch government. So they approached the Dutch government and were able to, they were granted their own private military that would chaperone them on their trade expeditions. So obviously this helped, right? You show up at the negotiating table and it's just me, I'm going to get a certain deal. But I show up at the negotiating table and it's me plus 12 guys with AK-47s, I'm probably going to get a better deal, right? So having the military escort really, really helped. But this marriage of military and industry sanctioned by the government is the first modern example that we have of the military-industrial complex. It worked very, very well, so well that obviously the British replicated this with the British East India Company, and it's very alive today in both America and in China. Okay, so getting back to our cycle, right? Productivity builds wealth. Wealth is reinvested in education. Education breeds better innovation. Better innovation builds a more competitive economy. A more competitive economy gives us access to global trade. Now we can do business everywhere, and that brings in more wealth. So now we're highly profitable. We're no longer the poverty-stricken country we used to be, and this brings new demands, namely for security, right? We have wealth now. That needs to be protected. We have trade routes now. Those need to be defended. And so this is the stage of empire where you see every single time aggressive investment into the military. And what happens as a consequence of that? You have a profitable entity because of their percentage of global trade, and now they're safe because they just built a massive military. Now, a profitable and safe entity is a fantastic investment opportunity. And so now they start attracting capital from the rest of the world, right? For the first time ever, everyone's taken notice. And this all sounds really, really good. What's not to like, right? The economy's growing, they're gaining respect and trust, money's coming flooding back in. But here's where the devil's in the details. For the first time ever, our emerging nation has access to something they've never had access to before. Debt, right? And debt is incredibly seductive, the creep of debt, because it allows you to grow faster than your organic productivity would normally. And very few people are able to reject that possibility. So as the living standards increase, right, people start demanding more stuff because the country's wealthier and everybody feels like they deserve more. The generations that used to work super hard in the old days and remember where they came from, they're long gone. The generation that's alive today in this empire, they've known nothing but wealth, right? Back then, they were poor, and they knew they were poor. And today, they're rich, and they know they're rich. And so they want nicer stuff. I mean, we don't want a nice car, do we? We want a nicer car than the one that we have. And that's going to cost more money. So we want to earn more money as we're rising up, right, in terms of global status. So the people start asking for higher wages. It's logical, right? They're rich now. They deserve more money. But everybody wants more money, including the owners of corporations and the shareholders. And they start looking at the wage creep in their country. They used to have cheap labor. The labor's not cheap anymore because the country's not poor anymore. They start looking at their margins. And every single time what we see is the executives essentially say, I wonder if we can get our products made somewhere cheaper. And our crafty Dutch friends looked across the North Sea to that funny little island and said, here's an idea. Why don't we have our ships designed here in the Netherlands, but let's have them built over there using cheap British labor. And just like that, they export the productive engine that made them rich in the first place. Now, this is great for business because margins go back up and shareholders are making more money, but a bunch of people just lost jobs. And therefore, the leverage to ask for higher earnings because there's less jobs for every person, right? People aren't happy. They get a little bit upset about this, right? And the government wants to keep the peace, so this is when they step in with all kinds of assistance. And back in Rome, this was the grain dole. Today, it's any number of welfare systems that we have, but it's the same story. It's the same thing. The government wants to keep the peace. Business is good, so they step in to take care of their people. And the problem with this eventually becomes that the nation's not as productive as it used to be. They exported that productive engine to somebody else. Somebody else has it now. So they're spending more on increased military demands, increased living standards at home, and they took all that debt and interest payments have to be made. And suddenly, our rising empire is feeling a little bit squeezed. But don't worry, they control the world reserve currency, and they can just print more. And they do. And no nation in history that's controlled the world reserve currency has resisted that temptation. So we're now expanding the money supply, increasing the wealth gap, and we're back to our sunset years of the empire. But that funny little island across the North Sea, productivity is fueling wealth. That productive engine that existed in the Netherlands, they've got it now. And they're reinvesting that wealth in education. They're building ships for the Dutch, the best ships in the world, so they got really good at building ships. And this was the seeds for what would eventually become the greatest navy that the world had ever seen, and the cycle begins back where it started, again and again and again. So what can we take away from this? It's the same movie that plays over and over again. And at the bookends of it, there's two things. On one side, it's productivity builds wealth. And on the other side, it's debt fuels decline. Now, this matters to me because I can make this super personal. I want to emancipate myself from the cycles of empire. I want the J. Martin empire to be on the way up. And we can all mimic these behaviors inside our personal activities. And let me give you a silly example. Let's imagine the J. Martin empire. And what do we know about the red flags, the red flag activities during the declining years? We see financial instability, we see civil unrest, and we see an external competitor. So the J. Martin empire is doing pretty well today. I've got a beautiful wife, I have 3 kids, we do reasonably well financially, but imagine tomorrow I stop working hard. I'm done. But I keep spending like I always have. Very quickly, I would find myself in financial distress, right? Red flag number 1. I'm in financial distress. And that's maybe fine as long as my wife and I are still getting along, despite our money problems, right? We carry on. But if we start blaming each other for these problems and saying it's your fault, no, it's your fault, and fighting over everything and little issues become big issues because we just can't agree, then suddenly we got 2 red flags, right? We have financial distress and we have internal conflict. And even that we can maintain for a decent amount of time until that external competitor shows up, the savvy, handsome gentleman at my wife's work who makes the offer of civility and stability that is just too hard to refuse. And suddenly, the J. Martin empire is in a lot of trouble. Now look, it's a silly example, I get it, but I use it because it makes it real. And it demonstrates that these things impact us at the micro level as well, which is great news because that means we can just stay conscious of those behaviors during the declining years and emulate those behaviors on the ascent. So what do we know about the ascent? What should we be doing about this, right? We know at the beginning of an empire stage, they're aligned in their values. Why is this important? Because it prevents us from being sucked into every petty argument that we may see surrounding us, and there is no shortage of that right now, but they are time-wasting distractions that pull us off course. If we are solid in our values, we know who we are and where we're going, and we're gonna stay the course, right? We're gonna go the right direction. Very, very important. May sound simple, hyper critical. Number 2, hard work. Simple, it's boring. Time-tested, works really, really well because productivity builds wealth. Often it's the simplest stuff that work the best. And number 3, education, meaning we improve our competitive advantage. We continue to increase our earning potential by bettering our skills, going to conferences like this, learning, right, and improving. Now, you may be like, Jay, this is the junior mining conference. I came for stock tips. Like, what are you spitting this at us for? But I lay this groundwork because this is how I think about my portfolio and how I digest this industry, how I think about macro. I boil things down to the simplest form that I can because I think we're foolish to think that the complex strategy is what's needed. It's the simple one that often wins. I study history because it helps me understand the present. I don't even try to predict the future, right? But if in history I can find those tried and tested processes that have worked countless times, that's what I know I have to do. And if I do that, it doesn't matter if the world order is changing. It doesn't matter what's happening at a macro level because the J. Martin empire is going to be all right. Okay. I'm really excited to get this conference started. I like to set the tone because that's how I think about things, and I'm going to be hosting a lot of conversations up here that are going to get kind of complex, right? And so it's important to be able to step back and get perspective. I like thinking about the world that way. Okay. Are you guys ready? Should we start the show? All right.